Hey everyone, it's Jen from Midnight Sky Fibers, and I wanted to share with you some of the knitting tools that I actually use. As most of you know, I do a lot of sample knitting and production knitting, so I am knitting both for myself and for sale and for other people every day, 365 days a year. So I use a lot of knitting tools, but there's really only very few that I actually use every day. I'm not a big collector of knitting tools that are really unusual or that take up a lot of space or that are really fancy. Most of the tools that I like are really utilitarian. They have to be able to put up with a lot of hard work, not get stuck in my stitches, and in a lot of cases they have to have multiple uses. So here are the tools that I actually use. First, blocking stitch markers. I love these. These are my absolute favorite stitch markers when I'm not using small pieces of thread, safety pins, or paper clips, which I am very prone to doing, even though I have a truly obscene number of stitch markers of all varieties. I actually really don't like most of the fancy stitch markers with beads on them. The only time when I think they're handy is when you need to tell apart different sections of a pattern, and that tends to be something like lace, in which case they then get caught. I really like locking stitch markers because not only can you stick them in your knitting and on your knitting needle, but you can also use them as stitch holders to hold a few stitches. You can use them instead of safety pins or pins to hold things in place while you're seaming together or sewing together your finished pieces. They work in crochet and in knitting, since a lot of you can hook them into your crochet to mark stitch places. Really all around they're my favorite stitch marker. They're the only stitch markers I buy. For all the other plain round circular ones, O-ring ones, I don't buy those. I have some of those ones. I never use them. I only use the locking stitch markers. Love them. Next, tapestry needles. I really like the tapestry needles that have a blunt but bent edge, as you can see in the photo on this one. It makes the blunt but bent tip makes it much easier to really get into the stitches without catching little bits of yarn or fabric as you're going along, which is handy when you're seaming or weaving in ends because you don't want it to show on the front. Straight tipped is fine. Sharp ones, depending on what you need to weave in, how you need to weave in the ends, are also okay. But these ones are my absolute favorite. You can usually get them in a pack of 2 at a yarn store. That's my primary ones that I always use. I usually have one stuck somewhere in my wallet, and I'm always buying these because I lose them out of my wallet constantly. And I like them enough that I'm willing to pay for them, even though I have tons of other tapestry needles that work okay. I prefer the shape of these ones best. And Tpins. Tpins, of course, come in all sorts of different lengths and thicknesses. I like the thick, longer ones better because they both work for lace and for holding together pieces while you're seaming if you're not using locking stitch markers. I mostly use mine for blocking lace, which means that the thick, longer ones are handy because it means that the lace isn't going to get caught in them or to fall off of them when you're blocking. I block heavily and thoroughly, and I pin lace objects out within an inch of their life, pulling them very, very taut. And small T-pins just don't stand up to that and just go flying off. Likewise, I don't use regular pins unless I'm sewing. These ones, I think it would just be a disaster if I use these ones for sewing. I have enough problems with killing my sewing machine as it is. But these ones show up in your knitting so that you can really see where you're pinning them, and they're thick enough to hold their place and to hold their own against yarn without distorting it too badly, which is important when you're trying to pin things in place and to create even seams, because the really fine small T-pins just tend to not be big enough when you're trying to seam together a worsted weight sweater and you're trying to make sure that the edges line up perfectly.